gotta say, those special effects guys are really new entry, and there goes the feature heat plowing right through the competition.
The Zenthar Compact had a saying, passed down through 11,000 years of conquest. The desert kills what the sword cannot. Their survey teams had used it to justify skipping arid worlds for centuries. Too hostile, too empty, too likely to finish the job before Zenthar soldiers even got the chance to try. So when High Overseer Kelvax Dorn found a strip of open, ungoverned, mineral-rich desert stretching across the northern third of a small blue planet, with almost no visible military infrastructure, and, according to every scan his fleet could run, almost no people, he called it the easiest landing zone his fleet had ever been assigned. He had never met a Tuareg guide named Amistan Ag Faudal, and he had certainly never met a camel. If you like watching overconfident empires get outmaneuvered by people who know their own backyard better than any scanner ever could, smash that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me the most useless piece of technology you've ever seen fail in the real world. Let's go to the Sahara, because the sand's about to teach a masterclass nobody up in orbit was ready for. The Sahara does not forgive assumptions. It is 3.5 million square miles of heat that kills the unprepared in hours, cold that kills the unprepared at night, and distance that swallows anyone who thinks a straight line is the same thing as a safe line. People have lived in it, moved through it, and mastered it for thousands of years, but mastery here does not look like a city. It looks like knowing exactly where the next well is, exactly how far a camel can walk before it needs water, and exactly which dunes will still be standing shape tomorrow, and which ones the wind will have rebuilt into something unrecognizable. None of that showed up on a Zenthar orbital scan. What showed up was heat signatures too sparse to register as an organized population, mineral deposits worth a fortune in refined ore, and open, flat terrain that looked, from 400 miles up, like the single easiest place in the entire hemisphere to put a landing force down without anyone noticing, until it was far too late to matter. High Overseer Kelvax Dorn reviewed the survey twice before authorizing the drop, because 11,000 years of doctrine had taught the compact that easy landing zones were rare enough to be suspicious. But the numbers held up both times. Sparse population, no detected military assets, no satellites monitoring this specific stretch closely enough to matter. A desert, in Kelvax's professional judgment, was simply a place where nothing important happened. He had no way of knowing that a desert, to the people who actually lived in it, was not empty at all. It was a network of wells, of trade routes, of families who had crossed the same stretches of sand for generations, and knew every landmark the wind hadn't yet erased. It simply didn't look like a network from orbit, because orbit doesn't see relationships. It sees heat and metal and flat ground, and the Sahara, from 400 miles up, offered plenty of all three and told the truth about none of it. The landing fleet, 6 troop transports, 2 command vessels, and a mineral processing rig the size of a small hill, dropped through clear desert sky at dawn, engines glowing amber against a horizon just beginning to turn gold, and touched down in a wide basin of hard-packed sand roughly 40 miles from the nearest well, which, as it happened, put them roughly 9 miles from a caravan route that had existed, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. Amistan Ag Faudal had been leading caravans across this stretch of desert since he was 16 years old, following a route his father had taught him, and his father's father had taught him, through country that had no roads because roads weren't necessary when you knew the land itself. He was 44 now, weathered by sun and wind into the specific kind of leanness the desert built into anyone who survived it long-term, and he was. At the moment, 6 alien transports dropped out of the sky less than 10 miles from his caravan, mostly annoyed that something had spooked his lead camel badly enough to break stride. "Something's wrong with Terk," he called back to his nephew Mousa, who at 19 was still young enough to think every strange noise in the desert was worth investigating personally. Wrong how? He spooked. Hasn't been spooked like that since the sandstorm 2 years back. Emistan reined his own camel to a stop and looked toward the horizon, where a column of dust and heat shimmer was rising from a spot that had, as far as he knew, never had anything on it before. What's that? Mousa squinted. Storm. No wind for it. Fire. No smoke. Colors wrong. Emistan watched the shimmer for a long moment, the way a man watches something he can't yet name but already distrusts. We'll go around. Whatever it is, it's not our business unless it comes looking for it. It came looking for it within the hour. High Overseer Kelvax deployed his first reconnaissance patrol at 700 local time. 6 soldiers in light desert-traded armor with orders to establish the perimeter, assess local conditions, and report back before the heat of full day, made extended movement inadvisable even for Zenthar equipment, which was built for a great many climates, but had never been extensively field-tested against a Saharan summer. The patrol leader, a methodical soldier named Vresh, took point with a scanner sweeping slow arcs across a horizon that, to his sensors, looked almost entirely empty. Heat signatures sparse, vegetation minimal, terrain flat and open in every direction, offering no natural cover, no elevated ground, and according to every readout he had no meaningful threat. Which was why, when Vresh's patrol crested a low rise and found themselves looking down into a shallow wadi occupied by a caravan of 19 camels, 4 goats, and 11 people, his first instinct was not caution. It was mild curiosity, the kind a soldier feels toward wildlife that hasn't yet been classified as dangerous. Report, Kelvax's voice came over the squad channel. What have you found? Vresh studied the caravan through his scope. Local fauna, overseer, large quadrupeds domesticated by the look of it, and a small group of humans, the dominant species designation matches survey data. 11 individuals, minimal visible technology, no detected weapons beyond what appears to be edged tools. Assessment. No threat, overseer. Recommend we observe and proceed with primary objective. It was, on paper, a completely reasonable assessment. 11 people with knives against 6 armed soldiers in powered armor was not, by any conventional military logic, a fair fight. What Vresh's scanner had not been built to measure, and what no Zenthar briefing document had thought to include, was that Amistan's people had spent their entire lives reading terrain, reading animals and reading strangers, and that a caravan halted in a wadi with its camels facing outward was not a caravan caught off guard. It was a caravan that had already noticed something was wrong and had quietly arranged itself accordingly. Something's watching us, Amistan said quietly to Mousa without turning his head. Ridge line northeast, don't look. I wasn't going to. Good, keep the goats calm. If this goes bad, goats panicking first is how you lose track of everything else. Vresh's patrol descended into the wadi at a measured pace, weapons lowered but not holstered, translator active and broadcasting, what Zenthar First Contact Protocol classified as a standard peaceful approach greeting. A series of tones meant to convey non-hostile intent to a species whose actual language the translator had not yet had time to properly parse. What it produced to human ears was a flat mechanical warble that sounded, according to Mouse's later description, like a phone ringing underwater. Amistan raised a hand, palm out, the universal gesture for stop and let's talk, which the Zenthar translator flagged correctly, for once, as a request for parley. You are the dominant local species, Vresh said, translator working through the accented cadence of a language it was still building a model for. We are the Zenthar Compact. We have claimed this territory for resource extraction. State your position. Amistan looked at the 6 armored figures, at the strange angular weapons they carried but hadn't raised, and made a series of calculations that had nothing to do with Zenthar military doctrine and everything to do with 44 years of desert experience. 6 of them, Armor that looked heavy meant slow in deep sand, whatever it was made of. No visible water supply on any of them. No visible shade gear beyond what their suits provided. And it was not yet 8 in the morning. "My position," Amiston said, through the strange, warbling translation, "is that you have landed in a place that will kill you by noon if you don't already know where the water is. And you don't." Vresh's translator processed this with a delay long enough that Amiston noticed it. "Clarify, are you making a threat?" "I'm making an observation. You want this territory, that's your business. But you're standing in the middle of the Sahara wearing gear built for somewhere else, and I promise you, the desert doesn't care what fleet you belong to." Vresh reported this exchange back to Kelvax word for word, and Kelvax, reviewing it from the command ship's bridge, filed it under the same category his survey team had filed the entire region. Irrelevant local commentary, no tactical significance. He ordered the patrol to proceed with establishing the perimeter and instructed the mineral rig to begin preliminary extraction scans. He would spend a great deal of the next 24 hours regretting that decision. By 11 p.m. local time, the temperature on the open desert FL or had climbed past 45 degrees Celsius, and the Zenthar landing force, built and tested primarily on worlds with temperate, humid, or cold climates, because the compact survey teams had genuinely never flagged this stretch of desert as worth detailed environmental modeling, began experiencing the first of what would become a long, embarrassing list of equipment failures. The first casualty was cooling efficiency in the standard issue armor, which had been rated for sustained operation up to 38 degrees, and was now, in practice, running nearly 10 degrees past its design tolerance, forcing internal systems to divert power away from weapons charge and toward life support just to keep soldiers from overheating inside their own suits. The second casualty was the mineral processing rig's primary intake fan, which had not been designed with sand infiltration in mind and had, within 3 hours of operation, ingested enough fine Saharan dust to seize 2 of its 4 primary bearings. The third casualty, and the one that would end up defining the entire engagement, was morale, because 6 soldiers standing perimeter watch in failing cooling systems, watching heat shimmer distort the horizon into something that looked actively hostile even when nothing was there, began reporting with increasing frequency that the environment itself felt like an active threat in a way their combat training had never prepared them to process. "Overseer," Vresh radioed in, voice tight with the specific strain of someone trying not to sound like he was struggling, requesting rotation. "Armor cooling is degrading faster than projected." "Rotation approved," Kelvax said, mildly irritated. "How long until the extraction rig is operational?" "Unclear, Overseer. Engineering reports contamination in the primary intake system." "Contamination from what?" There was a pause. "Sand, Overseer." Kelvax stared at the report for a long moment, the way a man stares at a sentence that technically makes sense and still feels like it shouldn't be true. 11,000 years of compact conquest doctrine, and nowhere in it had anyone thought to specifically address the possibility that an advanced mining operation might be defeated by fine-grained mineral particulate blowing directly into the machinery designed to extract fine-grained mineral particulate. "Fix it," he said, and went back to reviewing the rest of the deployment, unaware that the desert had only just begun making its case. While Zenthar engineering fought a losing battle against sand, Amiston's caravan had continued on its route, watching the strange metal shapes on the horizon from a careful distance, and by early afternoon had reached the well at Tin Aicha, where 3 other families were already gathered. A coincidence of timing that turned into something considerably more useful once Amiston explained what he'd seen. 6 of them, he said, over tea poured the traditional way, 3 rounds, strong and sweet, while camels rested in whatever shade the palms could offer. Armored, armed, and their machines already broken down twice that I could tell from a distance. They don't know the wells. They don't know the wind patterns. And from what I could see, they don't have proper shade. An older man named Bay Ag Alwali, who had run this route for nearly 50 years and had a reputation across 3 regions for having outlasted more sandstorms than most men had years, considered this with the specific patience of someone who had heard about a great many invasions, conquests, and grand plans over the decades, all of which the desert had, eventually, worn down to nothing. They came for the ground, he said. It wasn't a question. Look that way. Big machine, digging equipment, more transports than they needed for 6 soldiers. Then they'll be here a while, which means they'll need water eventually, whether they know it or not. Bay set down his tea glass and looked toward the horizon, where the faint shimmer of the Zenthar camp was still visible even at this distance. Word should go out. Not to fight them, not yet. No sense picking a fight with something you don't understand yet. Just to watch. The desert does most of the work on its own if you let it. We just need to know where they end up when it does. By evening, word had reached 4 more encampments along a network of trade routes that had existed for centuries, all of it moving faster and more efficiently than any Zenthar communication the invaders had set up, because it didn't depend on satellites or relay stations. It depended on people who talked to each other, who trusted each other, and who had, collectively, several centuries of accumulated knowledge about exactly how this particular desert dealt with things that didn't belong in it. Nobody had briefed High Overseer Kelvax on what happens to a desert at night, because nobody on his survey team had considered nighttime desert conditions relevant to a mission that was, on paper, about extracting minerals during daylight operations and returning to orbit before anything troublesome could develop. What happened was that the temperature, which had peaked past 45 degrees at midday, began falling as soon as the sun dropped below the horizon, and kept falling, steadily and without mercy, until by 2 in the morning it had dropped below 10 degrees Celsius. A nearly 40-degree swing that the Zenthar armor's already compromised cooling systems handled by, essentially, giving up entirely and leaving several soldiers standing perimeter watch in equipment now working against them in the opposite direction, no longer fighting to cool them down but failing to keep them warm. "This world is broken," a young trooper named Kessa muttered to Vresh, teeth audibly chattering through the comm channel. "It cannot decide what temperature it wants to be." "Focus on the perimeter," Vresh said, though he privately agreed with the sentiment more than doctrine strictly permitted. What neither of them noticed, because Zenthar night vision equipment had been calibrated for the kind of ambient light found on most inhabited worlds and was struggling badly against a moonless desert sky, was that they were being watched not by an armed force, not yet, but by 3 scouts from Bay's network, moving on foot along a dry wash a half-mile from the perimeter, counting soldiers, counting equipment, and noting, with quiet professional interest, exactly how far the guards' patrol pattern strayed from anything resembling a defensible perimeter. They walked the same line every 12 minutes. One of the scouts, a young woman named Tinhinen, reported back at the rendezvous point before dawn. Same pace, same route, like they haven't thought about someone watching them do it. "And the big machine. Not running at night. I think it's broken." Bay considered this over the fire, the desert cold enough now that everyone had wrapped themselves in heavier cloth than they'd needed 12 hours earlier. They don't know the land, they don't know the wells, their machine can't handle the sand, and their guards walk predictable lines in the dark. That's not an army. That's a group of very lost people with very good weapons. "So what do we do?" Bay looked toward the horizon, where the faintest hint of the Zenthar camp's lights were still visible against the star-thick sky. "We wait for them to need something from us. Everyone out here eventually does." By the second day, the Zenthar landing force had a problem that no amount of advanced technology could engineer its way out of. They were running out of water. Each soldier's suit carried a recycling system theoretically capable of sustaining them for extended operations, But that system had been designed around moderate exertion in moderate climates, not the specific combination of extreme heat, extreme cold, extreme dryness, and the physical strain of working around a mineral rig that had now failed twice more since its initial breakdown. The recycling units were operating well past their intended capacity, and the reserve tanks aboard the transport ships, while substantial, had been calculated for a mission profile that assumed local resupply would either be unnecessary or trivially easy to arrange. It was neither. Overseer, the fleet's logistics officer, reported, in the careful tone of someone delivering news they knew would not be well received. Current water reserves will sustain the landing force for approximately 60 more hours at current consumption. Recommend immediate resupply from orbit or identification of a local source. Kelvax, who had by this point spent 36 hours watching his mining operation fail, his soldiers struggle against a climate his survey had badly underestimated, and his careful conquest timeline dissolve into a series of increasingly undignified engineering emergencies, allowed himself a moment of genuine frustration before responding. Orbital resupply timeline. 41 hours, Overseer, given current fleet positioning. And local sources. There was a pause. Scans indicate several subsurface water deposits within a 50-mile radius, Overseer. However, our extraction equipment is not currently rated for water recovery, and the mineral rig's malfunction has consumed the engineering team's full attention. Kelvax stared at the report and arrived, slowly, at a conclusion that 11,000 years of compact doctrine had never prepared him to reach gracefully. The local population, the same 11 people his first patrol had dismissed as irrelevant local commentary, almost certainly knew exactly where every one of those water deposits was, how to reach them, and how to draw from them without the kind of specialized equipment his fleet had left in orbit. "Send a patrol," he said, with the specific weariness of a commander revising a plan for the 4th time in 2 days, to the local caravan. Fur trade. We need water, and I am beginning to suspect they are the only people on this stretch of desert who actually know where it is. The patrol that approached Amiston's caravan that afternoon carried no weapons raised, which Amiston noted immediately, and offered, through a translator that had improved considerably in the last day and a half, a proposal: technology, tools, materials, in exchange for guidance to a reliable water source. Amiston listened to the entire offer without interrupting, the way a man listens to someone who clearly doesn't yet understand the actual balance of power in the conversation they're having, and then responded with the patience of someone who had negotiated water rights, grazing rights, and trade disputes across 4 decades of desert life. "You want water," he said. "That's simple enough. Everyone out here needs water eventually. That's not a secret, and I'm not going to pretend it is. But you should understand something first. Out here, water isn't something you buy. It's something you're trusted with. Wells get shared because people look out for each other, not because of what they're offered in trade." The Zenthar negotiator, a mid-ranking diplomatic officer named Threll who had been assigned to the mission, specifically because his file listed extensive experience with primitive trade negotiations on 6 other worlds, tried a different approach. "We can offer significant technological advancement. Tools, medical." "We don't need your tools," Amiston said, not unkindly. "We've survived out here a very long time without them. What you need is trust, and trust isn't something you get from an offer. It's something you earn by showing people you understand the place you've landed in. So far, from what I've seen, you don't." Threll's translator flagged this as a rejection and reported it back to Kelvax as such, but Amiston hadn't actually said no. He'd said something considerably more dangerous to an invading force that hadn't yet realized it was already dependent on the goodwill of the people it had dismissed as irrelevant. He'd said, "Not yet." On the 3rd day, the mineral processing rig failed for the final time. its intake system so thoroughly compromised by sand infiltration that the engineering team, after 18 straight hours of attempted repair, formally reported it non-operational without a full parts replacement that would require, at minimum, a supply run back to the nearest compact staging world, a round trip measured in weeks, not hours. This news reached Kelvax at almost exactly the moment his logistics officer reported that water reserves had dropped to their final 24-hour reserve, with the promised orbital resupply delayed by an unrelated fleet emergency 2 systems away that would push the actual arrival time past the point of usefulness for the current deployment. It was, by any reasonable military standard, the collapse of the entire operation, and it had happened without a single shot fired, without a single soldier lost to combat, without the local population ever once mounting anything that resembled organized resistance. The desert itself had done all of it: the heat, the cold, the sand, the sheer indifferent scale of a landscape that did not care what fleet had landed in it or what that fleet had planned to do. Kelvax stood at the edge of the camp as the sun began to set on the 3rd day, watching heat shimmer give way to the first hints of the night's brutal cold, and did something that 11,000 years of compact conquest doctrine had never once required of him. He asked for help from the people he'd come to conquer. He walked, alone and unarmed, the 2 miles to where Amistan's caravan had made camp near a well that, he now understood with painful clarity, his fleet had passed within 11 miles of on their very first day and never detected. Amistan watched him approach with the calm of a man who had, over 4 decades, learned to recognize exactly what it looked like when the desert had finished making its point. "You're not with your soldiers," Amistan said, when Kelvax was close enough to speak without shouting. "No," Kelvax said. His translator had, over 3 days, developed a smoother grasp of the local dialect, enough that the words came through with something closer to genuine weariness than mechanical warble. "My mining equipment has failed. My water reserves are nearly exhausted. My resupply has been delayed, and I have come to understand, somewhat later than I should have, that you have known how this would go since the morning we landed." "I did," Amistan said, without any particular satisfaction in it. "The desert doesn't care about your fleet or your equipment. It's been killing overconfident men for longer than either of our peoples have kept written history. You're not the first to land here thinking flat, empty ground meant an easy landing. You won't be the last, either, not until word travels far enough that it stops happening." "Then I am asking," Kelvax said, and the words cost him something visible, "for water, for my people, not as conquest, as a request." Amistan studied him for a long moment. The way he'd studied countless strangers over the years arriving at wells they didn't fully understand the value of, and made the same calculation he always made: whether the person in front of him had learned enough yet to be trusted with something as valuable as water in a place where water was the only thing that actually mattered. "We'll give you water," he said finally, "enough to get your people through until your resupply arrives. But you'll take it the way everyone takes it out here, by helping draw it, by helping carry it, and by understanding when you're done that you didn't win anything here. You survived because we let you." What happened next would become, over the following months, one of the most retold stories in the entire region, passed between caravans, told at wells and around fires, eventually reaching ears in towns and cities far beyond the desert itself, growing slightly with every retelling but never losing the core of what had actually occurred. With the mining rig confirmed non-operational and water reserves critical, Kelvax made the decision to consolidate his remaining forces and abandon the ground operation entirely, ordering all 6 soldiers and the diplomatic team back to the primary transport for immediate evacuation to orbit, planning to regroup, resupply properly, and reassess whether this stretch of desert was worth a second attempt at all. What he had not accounted for, because nothing in 11,000 years of compact doctrine had ever needed to account for it, was that his primary transport, the largest vessel in the landing group and the one carrying the bulk of the mission's remaining equipment, had settled overnight into ground that had shifted beneath it, the fine desert sand compacting unevenly under its weight during the temperature swings of the last 3 days, until its primary landing struts sat noticeably off-level. One side sunk nearly half a meter deeper than the other. Getting it airborne again required exactly the kind of stabilization work the mining rig had been intended to help with, and the mining rig, of course, no longer functioned. It also required, as the engineering team discovered with mounting alarm, clearing several tons of drifted sand that had built up against the transport's lower hull during a minor windstorm the previous night, sand that had to be physically moved, by hand or by equipment, before the ship's landing struts could be freed enough to attempt liftoff. Kelvax, watching his engineering team attempt to shift sand with tools designed for mineral processing rather than excavation, made the second request of his career that 11,000 years of doctrine had never prepared him for. "You said you'd help us leave," he said to Amistan, who had come, along with several members of the wider caravan network, to observe what was, by any measure, becoming the most interesting thing to happen in this stretch of desert in living memory. "We are stuck." Amistan looked at the transport, half-buried, listing, its engineering team exhausted and out of practical options, and then looked at the 19 camels currently resting nearby, each one capable of sustained heavy hauling across exactly the kind of soft, uneven sand that had trapped the Zenthar's finest engineering. "We can move it," he said, "but it'll cost you something." "Name it." "Fair trade for the water we've already given, and a promise, the real kind, not the kind written down somewhere and forgotten, that if your people come back to this desert, you come back understanding it belongs to the people who already live in it, not as an empty stretch of ground to be claimed." Kelvax, standing in sand that had defeated his cooling systems, his mining equipment, his water logistics, and now his ability to simply leave, found himself agreeing to terms that no compact negotiator would have recommended, and that felt, in the moment, like the only reasonable choice available to him. What followed took the better part of 6 hours, and involved a system of harnesses, ropes, and coordinated pulling that Amistan's people had refined over generations for moving heavy loads across soft sand. Techniques developed for hauling salt, dates, and trade goods across some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet, applied now, with a certain grim satisfaction, to an interstellar spacecraft. 19 camels, arranged in a careful formation that Bay directed with the calm authority of a man who had moved far heavier and far more awkward loads than this over the decades, took up positions around the transport's lower hull. Harnessed to a network of lines, the Zenthar engineering team had, after some negotiation, agreed to attach at points their own sensors identified as structurally sound. "This will not work," Kessa said, watching the arrangement with open skepticism from a safe distance. "That vessel weighs more than every one of those animals combined, many times over." "It's not about weight," Amistan said, overhearing. "It's about angle, timing, and not fighting the sand. You dig a straight line through loose ground, it fights you the whole way. You work with the shift, pull at the right moment, let the ground help instead of resist, and even a heavy load comes free." On Bay's signal, a single sharp call, timed to a rhythm the camels had clearly worked with before, all 19 animals leaned into their harnesses at once, not in a sudden violent pull, but in a smooth, coordinated surge that distributed the strain evenly across the whole line, and the transport's sunken strut, freed from tons of compacted sand by hours of careful digging beforehand, shifted, groaned, and rose free of the ground it had been trapped in. The Zenthar engineering team, watching their multi-million credit interstellar vessel get pulled level by a formation of camels working in perfect, practiced coordination, filed a report back to Fleet Command that would go on to become, alongside Fleet Commander Vosk's crab boat incident several months later on the same world, one of the most read anomalous first contact reports in the entire compact archive. Vessel recovery achieved through coordinated animal labor, organized by local guide personnel using techniques with no equivalent in current compact engineering doctrine. Recommend immediate study of local load distribution and terrain adaptation methods. Note: local personnel appear to regard this as a routine solution, not a remarkable one. With the transport freed and level, its landing struts reinforced with makeshift bracing the caravan's own metalworkers had helped fabricate from spare parts, and water reserves replenished from the well at Tin Aicha under the same terms Amistan had negotiated. Kelvax's landing force prepared for departure 4 days after arriving in a mission that had begun as a straightforward mineral extraction operation and ended as something considerably harder to classify. Before boarding for the final time, Kelvax sought out Amistan one last time, finding him at the edge of camp checking the loads on his own caravan, preparing to continue the route his family had walked for generations, entirely unbothered by the fact that he had just spent an afternoon extracting an alien spacecraft from the sand with a team of camels. "I do not fully understand what happened here," Kelvax admitted. "By every measure my people used to assess a conquest, this world should have been simple. Sparse population, minimal technology, no organized defense." "You measured the wrong things," Amistan said. "You looked at how many of us there were and how few weapons we carried, and you decided that meant we were weak. But out here, the desert does the deciding, not us. All we did was know it better than you did. That's not a weapon, it's just knowing you're home. Will you tell others that we came?" Amistan considered this, looking out at the vast open stretch of gold and red sand rolling toward a horizon that had swallowed empires long before the Zenthar Compact had ever charted a star. "It'll get told. Stories always do, out here. But I expect by the time it's traveled far enough, half of it'll be exaggerated and the other half nobody will believe anyway. That's fine. The desert doesn't need anyone to believe in it. It just keeps being what it is, and eventually, everyone who tries to take it without understanding it learns the same lesson you just did." Kelvax's transport lifted off an hour later, engines glowing amber against a sky just beginning to soften toward evening, and climbed steadily until it was a point of light indistinguishable from the first stars beginning to appear, and then nothing at all. The Zenthar Compact's official record of the engagement, filed by High Overseer Kelvax Dorn upon return to Fleet Command, ran to nearly 20 pages and concluded with a classification recommendation that would be studied, debated, and eventually adopted as standing doctrine across the Compact's entire survey division. This world's arid regions must not be assessed by population density or visible infrastructure alone. Local populations demonstrate a level of environmental mastery that renders conventional resource assessment meaningless. Recommend all future survey teams cross-reference terrain data against local guide networks before authorizing any ground operation. Note: local personnel extracted a compact transport vessel from compacted sand using domesticated pack animals and hand tools, in significantly less time than our own engineering team required to diagnose the problem. Recommend the region be reclassified from undefended resource zone to do not underestimate. Back in the desert, life continued much as it always had. Amistan's caravan reached IT's destination 6 days later, the story of the strange metal ship and its stranger crew already traveling ahead of them along the trade routes, gaining detail and color with every telling, exactly as Amistan had predicted. Bay retired from active caravan work 2 seasons later, but told the story at every gathering he attended for the rest of his life, usually ending it the same way. "Big machine, powerful weapons, technology we couldn't even name," he'd say, over tea poured the traditional way. And in the end, what got them out of trouble was 19 camels and people who knew where the water was. The desert doesn't care how far you've traveled to get here. It only cares whether you understand it once you have. Somewhere in compact archives, light years from the Sahara, the incident report on the region remained flagged permanently with a single addendum that no officer ever removed. A note added by an anonymous logistics clerk sometime after the report's initial filing that simply read "See also. Bering Sea Fishing Fleet, similar findings." Nobody in the compact ever quite worked out what it meant that this small, unassuming planet kept producing populations who treated invasion as a scheduling inconvenience rather than an emergency, and defeated advanced fleets not through weapons or war, but through the simple, stubborn fact of already knowing their own home better than anyone arriving from the stars ever could. If you enjoyed watching another empire get quietly outmaneuvered by people who know their own ground, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me which Earth environment you think would humble an invading fleet the fastest. Thanks for riding along. I'll see you in the next one.